everyone. First of all, I want to apologize that you have to pay for this. COVID times are really, really hard on the marketing team's budget. However, the good news is I've just been given a lot more of the country. So Texas and everything on the west side of the country is now mine. So guys are in my region, and once things start opening up, I'll be down to do an in-person tasting with you guys, definitely. So hold me to that. So hi, I'm Neil. I'm the Balvenie ambassador for the West Coast, currently living in Los Angeles. Sorry guys, it was not my choice. I was told I had to live in California. Don't hate on me for it. And we've got a really fun tasting tonight because I just moved to the United States when we launched Stories, and I probably wasn't quite involved in it as the planning as much as I would have liked to have been. And this is me getting to relook the Stories range in a really happy place. And also, thank you so much, Nathan. I'll let you spin on that one. Fake, come on, man. That I get the chance to go and buy some of the 26 dark barley. You know, as I said, these hard COVID times, it gave me an excuse to run out and get a little sample bottle of 26. So I'm excited. Right, to it. One thing I could supply was some extra drams, 12 and 14. I hope you're all loosening up your palates before the tasting with some of those samples, because what else are we here to do? It's Thursday night, let's drink some whiskey. So, about the Balvenie Distillery and what we do. If I don't cover these these parts at the start, I basically lose my job, because the Balvenie and what I do is all about sharing the stories about the people at the distillery. Now, at the distillery, we didn't start producing single malt and bottling it until 1973. Before that, Balvenie was used all for blends, but on that first bottle that was ever sold in 1973, it said a term handcrafted. I'm needing more.
It's gonna be done.
Said handcrafted in Bamshire. Now, Bamshire is the area around Dufftown where we make our whiskey in Speyside. So, and handcrafted really talks about the people that we have at the distillery. And that term handcrafted has never left what we do as an ethos to the distillery. And we have these things that aren't uniquely special to the Balvenie, but combined make us incredibly handcrafted. And they're Balvenie's 5 rare crafts. And so the first one is we have our own farm. We get an amount of their land that they rent from us, percentage-wise. It can differ every year, but it's barley, homegrown barley from the Balvenie Mains farm. Really rare to have distilleries having that. There's lots of barley fields around Scotland, but as I've got a friend that's a big farmer, most of that grain goes to animal feed, and it's not high enough grade to be distillery grade. But at our farm, we put into the lease to the farmers, we need a distillery grade quality grain off your land each year. So Balvenie can make single estate whiskey. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, because some pretty cool shit going on later on. Next is we have our own floor maltings. Floor maltings is the traditional way of changing barley into malted barley. You need to do that so you have the sugars inside the grain and enzyme development for fermentation. Having our own floor maltings is like basically pornography for whiskey geeks when they turn up to the distillery. We are the only one in mainland of Scotland that works all year round. The rest of the other 5 are all on the Isles. And, you know, it's just cool. When you see it, it's just cool. And also allows us to do more experimental small batch things with our grain that distilleries that take in from like bigger maltsters can't get, essentially. So that's cool. Third one is that we have our own coppersmith on site. A coppersmith is someone that works with copper. And of course, we all know whiskey is distilled in copper pot stills. The size and shape of those in each distillery are different, and it's going to give us a different style to every whiskey. Balvenie stills give us quite a lot of reflux, They have a boil ball, which you see kind of represented on the top of the bottle. And it gives us a lot of reflux and a sweet malty spirit from our still. But over time, the copper reacts with congeners inside and it gets thinner. And having a coppersmith on site maintains our stills are working at the best of capacity. But site for us at Dufftown is our older brother, Glenfiddich, and then a smaller distillery, almost like a test distillery called Kinninvie. So our coppersmith, Dennis McBain, looks after all the stills on site. But, you know, obviously Dennis, very cool job working with stills. But what makes him cool for me is that he's worked at the distillery for 63 years. He's the longest serving member of staff at William Grant and Sons. And if you look back 63 years ago, it's really time when I should have been drinking whiskey and been involved in it, because it was the good old days of no health and safety. So like things that used to happen where you'd get a ration of whiskey when you went into your shift in the morning. You would have days when, and people in the distillery that they were never classed as alcoholics. In the northeast of Scotland in the 60s, if you were an alcoholic, you were just merely Jimmy that likes a drink. And nobody said anything about, oh, Jimmy's an affa bugger. Oh, he likes a drink of that whiskey. And nobody would care. And then one of the funniest things, oh no, we'll leave that story to a bit later. But Dennis, super cool. And he also fishes. So when I'm up at the distillery, I can spend a whole day on the River Spey trying to fish for salmon with Dennis McBain. What's better than a day's fishing? Very little in my eyes. So then the fourth one of the 5 rare crafts is that we have our own cooperage. Cooperage is my favorite part of the whole distillery, essentially. And that was partly due to the old head cooper, Ian MacDonald. He's now retired, but the whole site smells, things that are going on in there, knowing that those casks that they're working on give us so much flavor that we're going to enjoy in our glass later on. It's just a great place. And then the fifth and final one of Balvenie 5 rare crafts is a gentleman whose signature is on every bottle of the Balvenie, a gentleman called David Charles Stewart. He's the longest serving whiskey maker in the Scotch whiskey industry. He'll be celebrating his, oh my gosh, 58th year this year working with the Balvenie, and he's a legend. We'll talk more about him, I suppose, and some of the whiskies, but if you think about every whiskey bar that you ever drink in or go and see, that back wall full of whiskies, hundreds of bottles of different whiskies from around the world. David Stewart is one of the few individuals, one still alive to this day, but who's really helped shape what we drink as whiskey. He invented the finishing process. He made Glenfiddich the biggest selling single malt in the world, with whiskies like the 21 rum cask, the 15 Solera and Fiddick. But he's most famous for something called double cask maturation, or cask finishing, and we pioneered that at Balvenie. So,
Well, I've heard that.
That's the company stuff done, all right? Let's just get into the whiskey. And the double cask maturation thing and David Stewart is a perfect way to start the first whiskey. So the first whiskey that we're going to drink, the first one in the Stories range, is the Balvenie 12, Sweet Toast of American Oak. And I'll have to admit, this has been the quarantine favorite. There has been a couple of nights where, a couple of mornings I've walked through to the computer and realized, oh, shit, you've emptied this bottle again. No wonder your head's a little bit fuzzy. And honestly, it's probably not my first choice of whiskeys ever. Like if I was in a bar, there's a lot more I would think about it. However, proof is in the pudding. It's been going down for all the after hours of the tastings. So yeah, we like this whiskey a lot. And the story of this whiskey, and really it shares a bit more story about what we do at the distillery, is that every one of those craftsmen that I talked about and I touched on, like men that had worked at the distillery for 50, 60 years, they're really seen as the master craftsman. And the master craftsman is someone really in the twilight of their career, But before you get there, you have to have done your time as a craftsman. But before the craftsman stage, and the first stage of what we deem to be the craftsman's journey, is the apprentice stage. And how do apprentices learn? By watching the masters. And David's apprentice, who we've been celebrating for last couple of years, only because she just turned 25 last couple of years, is a young lady called Kelsey McKechnie. And she's truly one of my favorite people in the world to talk about whiskey. And I would say one tip about Kelsey: don't really ask her any stupid, crazy whiskey questions about flavor or technicality, because wow, she knocks out the park. And every time I hear her, when it starts getting more technical, I always have to time out. I'm like, oh, well, I was out in the classroom in chemistry more than I was ever in it, Kelsey. I don't know about these things. Oh. But also with her second name, McKechnie, my Scottish tongue even struggles with that. So you need a little bit of whiskey in your mouth. So let's get into her whiskey. Now, this was the first whiskey that has been made by her, that was bottled by her. And the chaps in the distillery, David and Brian Kinsman, who's the malt master for the rest of the group, challenged Kelsey with ramping up fruity character in the Balvenie, to go out, play around with different oak types, different cask types, to see how we could raise the fruit character. Now, this is where I want you guys to be a little bit more interactive on the chat function. I want you guys to start typing in your nosing notes, because let's be honest, I'm a little bit crazy. So my nosing notes start to go a little bit crazy from time to time. And wherever you were brought up, you get different nosing notes. However, I have got a very American nosing note.
My kids are asking about Zeke too. They're like, can you see?
Oh, I'm not sure if that was a question or not, but when I'm nosing this whiskey, I definitely got the most American nosing notes. Oh gosh, is everyone shy on scared about crazy nosing notes? Come on, share your nosing notes. But when we were doing the national launch of this, I was doing up in Chicago, I was doing a tasting for everyone, and the lady that looked after on premise up in Chicago nosed it. And she went, Neil, it smells like Samoas. And I looked at her and I was like, how do you know what these Pacific Islanders smell like? I was like, what are you talking about? Like, what? This is Balvenie, what Pacific? And she's like, no, Neil, you idiot. I'm talking about Girl Scout cookies. At this moment, I lost it. I was like, oh my God, Girl Scout cookies. One of the most American things I can think of next to like Twinkies and Budweiser is Girl Scout cookies. But only like a month and a half into living here, I'd not seen these Girl Scout cookies. So she had to break it down on what the hell they were, essentially. So on the nose, she's describing some biscuity notes. That's classic Balvenie. With, if you look at the spirit, we got a malty sweetness to our whiskey. We're getting some dark chocolate notes in there. A little bit of coconut, I believe, works, and some like caramel sweetness. This whiskey's aged in ex-bourbon casks for about 12 years. And then after 12 years, the finishing process is where Kelsey was getting to experiment a lot. And what she was experimenting with and what they finished on was New American oak casks, virgin New American oak casks from the Calvin cooperage. Now, the Calvin cooperage is two brothers from Scotland that moved their Glasgow cooperage down to Louisville in Kentucky, and generally speaking, is seen as the best cooperage in the United States. And they do something slightly different. You know, in bourbon barrels, there's a aggressive charring getting put onto the barrels when they're being made. And if you were to touch the outside of the casks after it had been charred, you don't feel any heat on them. Down in Louisville, they'll do something slightly different. Like the Spanish way, they toast casks. So they use the excess cuttings from the oak, have a fire in the middle, and they let that oak fire slowly toast and penetrate the oak. So if you were to touch the outside of the cask coming to the end, you feel the heat's penetrated through it. That's opened up the wood for the spirit instead of putting a layer of char in it. Those casks were taken up to our own cooperage, and our head cooper at the time, Ian MacDonald, and Kelsey thought to themselves, if we retoast these, so by putting a double toast on them, will we allow the spirit to go further into the cask? It did. It opened up more of the oak. So when, after 12 years and then finishing this whiskey, usually finishing process are going to take about 6 weeks. After about 6 weeks, they're going to check it just to see how that new cask is taking a hold of the flavor of the liquid. And after 6 weeks, they had a big surprise. That double toasting had opened up so much of the oak that the flavor imparted onto the whiskey was so huge that only after 10 weeks, this whiskey is finished for, and then it's taken out of that cask. If you consider that Dalmore do multiple finishes of 2.5 years with different European oaks, or Doublewood, for example, is only 9 months finishing, 10 weeks is a really small amount of time to impart a lot of flavor onto that whiskey. And if anyone's ever drank the 12 single barrel Balvenie, think of that and then put into a new American oak, and you get this. I love shortbread, wet hay, nice, green apple. I don't pick up so much apple notes, but Eric, one note, apricot, and someone touched on a note of stone fruit. Well done there, because that apricot and stone fruit note is something that commonly people find in Balvenies from a 12 double wood all the way up to a 50. And it's a really classic Balvenie note. And yeah, it only comes from time to time, but you'll get that now and again. So that's a nice one. But what I love about this on the mouth is that sweetness of the Balvenies there. It's easy drinking. My only problem is I guzzle it like it's juice, which is not so good when you're sitting in your apartment by yourself, finishing a tasting, and then you realize it's midnight and everyone is awake in Scotland with their kids and you're on the charge after a bottle of whiskey. So that was last week with this. So I think we should get that one away, but you know, we should consider just before we move on to the next one, I'm a bit cautious about time constraints, this is a 26-year-old young lady's first ever whiskey that's been released. Now, let's be honest. As the Balvenie, we don't really release like shit whiskey. And if it's not good enough, it's not really going to see the light of day. And there's a lot of examples of whiskey in our warehouses that will never see the light of day because it's just not Balvenie, essentially. And to be just starting off her journey in the whiskey industry, and Kelsey starts with us when she's in her placement year at university, at Glasgow University. And she was studying chemistry, and she took a work placement at William Grant & Sons. She was working on the labs, and she quite quickly managed to get onto the nosing panel. So any of our bottling plants, whether it is down in Glasgow or up in Dufftown, anyone on site can qualify themselves to go and work on the nosing panel. So if you sit in the laboratory, all the glasses get lined up. Some days there's 20, some days there's 30. And depending if you pass the test, even if you work in the cafe, the bottling line, you're an accountant or you're IT, if you pass that, you can go in and analyze the spirit. And it goes through every day. Each run of bottles, probably 40 different noses, as well as all the malt masters. And then she shone in that work placement, so much so that David said, you know, if you don't have anything else organized, we would really like to take you back and give you a job after you graduate. So she's been with us since she's graduated, 4.5 years working under David Stewart, and she's producing something like this. I think Balvenie is in good shape going forward. So Kelsey, Slange. Now, it's decision time because I'm not sure what we should drink next. It's between two, but let's go for the 19. Let's go for the 19. So, first of all, hats off, gentlemen and ladies. You guys are the first people in America to do an official tasting with this whiskey. This whiskey had been sourced from very far afield. We're not releasing this over here in America this year because we just can't do it justice, because we want to be sharing it with you guys in person. And this is arguably, in my time working with Balvenie, probably one of the most exciting whiskeys we've released. I think from a whiskey geek point of view, you guys have got the actual bottling, which I need to check my notes. I don't even have it on the screen. Is percentage-wise, I think it must be David Stewart's favorite at 47.3%. Yeah, correct. Edge of burnt head wood. I've got one at cast strength at 58% alcohol, so a little bit more robuster. So I'm going to add a little bit of water into mine. But this whiskey's cool because, first of all, I touched on the first one of Balvenie's 5 rare crafts, that we have our own farm. Yeah, the Edge of Burnt Head Wood is not available yet. Oh, 48.7, sorry, it's a little bit higher. It's not released in America yet, and this is definitely the first club that's tried it in America officially. So this is our first release of barley that's 100% from our own farm. So from grain to glass, all done in one site, which is pretty damn cool, that first one. And secondly, and this is something we're not allowed to talk about flavor-wise, because the Scotch Malt Whisky Association is kind of unsure about calling this a whiskey as such. So this whiskey is a whiskey that, instead of being the barley at the end of malting's process, when you're drying it, if you dry it with anthracite, which is smokeless coal, it imparts no flavor onto the grain. But if you dry it with peat, and peat which is basically soil that burns really well, that gives off smoke or reek. That penetrates the grain and gives you a smoky whiskey. But one thing that's different about this whiskey is that instead, well, peat, a small dash of peat, but it also uses heather. And heather is basically like a plant that's all over the Scottish hills, that if you go up in August, around about this time of the year, the hills of Scotland are purple. Heather's what grouse love to live in and eat, and most of the Highlands of Scotland are sporting estates, and the grouse live on those estates. So we've got a lot of heather. And when you're using heather, it's interesting because not that many distilleries have ever used heather. And the big problem the Scotch Whisky Association had with this whiskey on allowing us to release this was the precedence of who the hell uses heather to dry their grain. However, we found precedent. Highland Park, if you look back to the early 1900s, and in like even just after wartime, you will find data about Highland Park having a heather shed, and the heather shed was next to their maltings, and they used to use heather to dry some of their barley. So heather is this like small little kind of plant that's covered on the mountains, really rough. And if you ever been in the hills in Scotland, heather has its distinct smell. I often find heather to be quite green on the nose, quite fresh, but then you have this lovely flowery characteristic. I can't say it smells like heather. And to be quite honest with you, with this sample, I don't smell as much heather as I did when I first tried this whiskey. And we tried this, I tried a sample of this maybe 4 years ago, and it blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, it smells like walking in the hills of Scotland. And I was like, no. But I think that was maybe just my mind playing games with me. You know, if someone says something, it just plays with your head. But it's delicate. You know, this whiskey has been aged in American oak, and most likely with the nosing notes. And when you look at the color here in this cast sample, it's really light. You'd expect something a little bit darker in color from something that was first fill. We don't actually know what the hell we put this juice into. We've got the cast numbers, but the casts all look refurby, but it kind of dates back to when we didn't have enough cask information available. So I'm guessing it's more refill casks. So it's super light, delicate. I definitely do get some of that green herbaceous notes, but I'm not allowed to say heather. So I didn't say it. Thank you very much, whoever did write that. And I think leather, people saying leather on the nose, I quite like that. A very expensive, soft, delicate leather, but lovely. And then let's drink. So this is our first ever release of 100% estate barley, grain to bottle. I probably didn't add enough water to that there because it's a little bit more fiery than it probably a 19-year-old Balvenie usually is. So I'm going to add another splash, but that greenness that I was picking up on the nose, I find I get a delicate clove note on the palate with this. The sweetness on the mouth is like bouncing around with the dryness from the oak. That, yeah, we get that sweetness, but wow, the cask takes a hold of your mouth, probably because I'm on a higher percentage one. It's really good just to drink good whiskey with good people. And such a treat. What do we think? Oh, silky. I love that description. Yeah, definitely. The sweetness is very much up front, and then just as you keep on drinking, that dryness just. And with a little bit more water in it for me, I start to get a little bit more smoke or old oak notes. And it's probably more old oak coming through, but yeah, it just keeps on giving and giving, doesn't it? Touch of ginger, nice, nice. Woo. Wow, wow. Now, a little bit more about the story behind this whiskey as you sip and enjoy it and just keep on getting to know it. Because the story talks about really kind of a couple of my favorite people at the distillery that humor me endlessly when I'm at the distillery. Now, getting heather is something that's probably not that hard to do in Scotland as the hills are covered in them. However, I'm pretty sure if you're stealing heather off someone else's land and you get caught, they're not going to be that happy about it. However, William Grant and Sons, the family that own us, bought at the other side of the road from where the distilleries sit, and the distilleries really sit at the bottom of the valley where the river runs through. We bought the hills next to the distilleries, so we had water to produce enough whiskey. And when production increased at Balvenie, Glenfiddich, and then the introduction of Kinninvie, we needed those mountains especially, well, not mountains, hills beside the distillery. And we bought all three farms that are next door to the distillery. So Balvenie Mains was the first one, and really that's where the water source for Glenfiddich comes. But on this side of that hill, there's another 22 springs on the Colvin Hills that pop out, which is more than enough water for us to be feeding Balvenie and Kinninvie with, and a little bit extra for process for Glenfiddich. But those, when the farmland finishes, there's a wood, and the old wood at the top of the hill is the old kind of cattle walking way from Dufftown to Aberlour. So Speyside, quite a small place really when you're driving around. Dufftown, where we make Balvenie, Glenfiddich, but also famous for like Glendullan, Mortlake. It's only 4 miles away from Aberlour, famous for Aberlour whiskey essentially, and also now Glenelg. Only 4 miles, but in the old days, there was that walk across the hills. It was faster than, obviously, there was no cars in those days. But it was also the old road for bootlegging whiskey on, that William Grant, when he found Glenfiddich's site originally, knew about the Robbie Dew Spring at the top of the hills there, and knew it would be a good water source for his whiskey, only because as a boy, as a shepherd, there was people bootlegging whiskey with illicit stills, portable illicit stills, making whiskey when he was a shepherd up there. So he knew it was a good place. But all along that walkway now, there's a load of heather. So our estate manager, Dave Stewart, now don't get him confused with our malt master, David Stewart. Dave Stewart is fondly known as the gardener on site. And honestly, Dave Stewart was brought up at the site. I think his mother lived on site. Their family worked on the whiskey distillery. He's worked on site for years, and he might have started off as a gardener. He moved up to the estate manager at one stage. He now looks after the archives, and he's really passionate about the history. And he was sent up by the then distillery manager, a chap called Ian Miller, which we'll touch on a little bit later on the last whiskey. And he was said, go and get some heather. So he drove his little tractor with his cart on the back up to the top of Burnt Head Wood, picked a load of heather and drove it back down. Now the chaps in the floor malting thought we better dry this off before we put it into the furnace before the barley. The first got thrown in. The dried heather went up in smoke, gone in a second. Okay, that's not what we can do to get any benefit from this heather. So what they did was soak the heather in buckets of water, kind of similar to the moist peat level of moisture, and then threw them back in moist. And then they slowly gave off that nice heathery smoke. As I said, can't talk about the heather really changing the whiskey, supposedly, from the Scotch Malt Whiskey Association. It's good they keep us right, but there's definitely something different about this raw spirit. And even when the whiskey was distilled off the stills, they could see where they tasted something different on their samples. Hard to pinpoint exactly what it was on taste, but different to our usual juice. So yeah, 2020, this one came out. This came out about 3 months ago in the UK, and my product allowance this year, I bought 2 bottles and sent them to my grandmother's house in Scotland. This is how much I rate this whiskey. And I'm really excited for the launch when it comes over to America, so I can drink lots of it. Okay, so I'm going to push that a little bit more. Push that one to the side, because now we move on to the serious stuff, some of the expensive stuff. Thank you guys for letting me go and find a little miniature of this from an account, because I must admit this is a bit of a painful subject, this whiskey for me. Before I moved to take over the West Coast ambassador role, I lived in Southeast Asia and represented Balvenie in Southeast Asia for about 4.5 years. Every sample in Southeast Asia got sent to me directly from the distillery, and it was really easy to get samples of good liquid. And I had lots of fun stuff. And as I was packing up and finishing off to move over here, for about 1.5 months, I'd used a box, 3 bottles of this 26 dark barley, just as a footrest, thinking, I'll leave it. I don't need it. I don't need to. I've tasted the liquid. I don't need to open any of those bottles. I don't need to steal one for myself, because in America, they're the biggest market in the world. They must get everything. So I left it there, and I was like, oh, it's a nice gift to give to the new ambassador. Get to America. Oh no, I don't have 3 bottles of that anywhere near me, and we have to share any tasting stock with a load of launch events. So I never got a bottle of this. And if anyone knows anyone that's Scottish, you might be able to understand this, but Scots people are the tightest bastards in the world. My arms are so short and my pockets are so deep. Thinking about a $600 bottle of whiskey, which was never a $600 bottle of whiskey because every shop put another $200, $400, maybe doubling the price of this whiskey. I'm not paying for that. That's way too much for a bottle of whiskey, man. So I'm really sad about it. However, it does mean it makes drinking it with you guys all that more special. So honestly, 26 years old is really old whiskey. That once you get over, I think, I shouldn't put that in there because I want to see the color. Once you get over 21 years, and even really on the Balvenie 21 Portwood, the whiskey changes. The whole nature of the beast changes. That if the whiskey moves into something a lot more regal, complex, old, and delicate. And Balvenie kind of, after that 21 years, it just starts changing into a different kind of whiskey. And oh, shit, that's amazing. Great. So this whiskey is really a story of a mistake that happened. That one of the things that the family believe in, and really what we preach from the distillery, is the difference between good and great whiskey is a human eye and hand. Now, when we look at the world of whiskey, really most of it's so computerized. You go to some of your favorite distilleries in Scotland and it can be a little bit sad when you just see a computer and one person pressing buttons. But in every single part of the Balvenie, you see people. Now, over the last kind of coming up to 6 years, I've heard a lot about people making mistakes at distilleries and costing us a lot of money, like pouring new make spirit into a barrel of 21 or a vat of 21 is a big mistake. Funny stories like that. But instead of it being a disaster and costing us millions, the mistake with this whiskey kind of sparked an idea. So the people that were working in the floor maltings one day, going about their business as normal, start to smell like burning. But it's not burning from the fire, it's coming from upstairs. And something had gone wrong with the pagoda roof. And if anyone's looked at those iconic pictures of Scottish whiskey distilleries, that pagoda roof is where the barley sits on top of like a mesh floor and dries with a fire below it, probably about 6-7 yards below hand. And something was wrong with the pagoda roof. The ventilation was wrong. There was too much heat hitting the barley, so they were burning it and they were toasting it. So basically, when they looked at that, it was like, oh no, bad times, we burn it. That's a waste. We have to throw it. So, but it got them thinking. Those guys in the beer industry, they use toasted malt, they use chocolate malt, they use all sorts of kind of stuff, crystal and stuff. Wonder what would happen if we tried to use that in a mix of whiskey. So they kept some of that burnt stuff and then they bought in more heavily toasted malt than what we would use normally. The big problem with like toasting malt, us as distillers are looking for yield of alcohol from each grain or each ton. And yield of alcohol is basically how much alcohol we're getting off the still at the end or from fermentation. And it can be judged in that way. And so we don't use that kind of malt. Now, when we look to today and we look at some of our friends in North America, I remember a couple of years ago being at Westlands in Seattle for the first time. And they were giving it big chat, you know, like, oh, we've got the 5 different malts, we use this yeast. And it was like, this is how we make our whiskey. And then like a year later, it's like, oh, mic drop, here's our 26-year-old with the roasted malt, guys. Come on. We've got age in ours. But that's what's cool about American single malt is the craft guys are just pushing what's cool and what can be done with whiskey. So when this batch of barley got delivered, instead of the big truckload that usually comes in that holds 24 tons of malted barley. Our floor maltings, by the way, is not big enough to service the whole distillery and all of our production. So each batch has a percentage of our own floor malted whiskey in it, mixed in with some industrial malted stuff. But instead of that big truck with 24 tons, I think it is, that comes down, because this was a smaller load, it came in bags. Now, that day is still talked about to this day because the two people on shift are two people I love and I spent a lot of time with working at the distillery. A chap called Robbie Gormley, who worked in the malt for a long time, and a gentleman called Brian Webster. He's worked now for us for 52 years at the distillery. And they tell the story that they were working that day, and when that load of malt was delivered, there's no cover in the courtyard of Balvenie. And in a traditional fine northeast Scottish day, we would describe it as Gai Drich. Now, Gai Drich basically means wet, miserable, cloudy, foggy. Basically, it's a wetness that goes through to your bones. And even in like middle of summer when it's not quite going through to your bones, oh, it's still cold. So these guys had this, there was 16 tons of this in bags, but the malt bins where this was to be stored was 3 stories above them. And as the only boys available on shift, they had to lug every one of those bags up all those stairs before it really started to rain. And they still moan about it to this day. And if you ever like go to the distillery, you'll probably see Brian Webster cutting around. You ask him, but you'll be in for like a half an hour to an hour long story with him recalling that day. Old Scottish men talking stories. They go on a little bit. But that batch, that barley, that it was very lightly toasted malt. In our descriptors, when you're looking at the ratio of like the mix that went into the mash bill. So in Scotland, we never talk about a mash bill. There never is. It's 100% malted barley, usually just all the same. But in the kind of records of what went into that mash, there was 10% of the stuff they burnt, and the rest of the 90% was this really lightly toasted malt. Now, they described it as chocolate malt on the write-up, but if we were to look at it today in more modern thinking, honestly, it's a lot less than what a brewer, if anyone knows a brewing background, what that looks like on a toasting level. They distill it. There's definitely difference in it. There's not as much alcohol coming from fermentation. We know that's going to be the case. We then take the liquid and we put it into first fill bourbon barrels. And literally the whiskey kind of just sits there and chills for a bit. But then you move 14 years after it was distilled, and you come into a really interesting time with the distillery. And I'm so fortunate that I know so many of these decent people at the distillery, but in particular, the distillery manager, Ian Miller, who had worked at about 5 Diageo or whoever owned them before distilleries, came to be the distillery manager on site at Dufftown. Ian Miller, for many ambassadors around the world, is the be and all, the whiskey god, because after he finished the manager of the site at Glenfiddich and Balvenie, many say he makes the 2 whiskeys great, was he took over the role as a Glenfiddich global brand ambassador. So when I had my final job interview, my 6th and final one, after going past the snow and the truck, the whiskey truck, I had an interview with Ian Miller. I'm not going to lie, it was my 6th interview. I pretty much lost interest in the process. I was like, God, 6 job interviews, that's crazy. So he was about the only person I did not do my due diligence on. And as we were having a coffee and a bacon roll in the morning before the formal part started, he was telling me, I managed Martlet, Blair Athol, and he named 5 other distilleries. I was like, holy shit, who is this guy that is interviewing me? And then he managed site at Dufftown for us. And any whiskey that you think is like cool, or you should think is cool, like Longrose, Springbanks, the great guys in Isla, some of the stuff up north. Ian Miller's been there when some of that craziest shit was distilled with his friends. And I kind of describe his time as when he starts at Glenfiddich and Balvenie managing site as a bit of a nonsense, because the industry at that point was all about yield of alcohol. We weren't looking so much for quality. And at this time, if you look back at what Ian Miller was doing with the experiments with David Stewart, he was just going crazy. And often with the last whiskey, I describe it as shit. Ian Miller was getting bored. That's why he started making peated Balvenie. But yeah, they got to run riot, basically, and this was one of the experiments. So 14 years on, we start releasing a whole series of random juice. Big Balvenie fans here will remember the limited edition 17 series, just before the 17-year-old Doublewood. I'm going to put some lights on here because it's a bit bright. I'm looking a little bit shiny on the screen. I hope that's okay. And we start releasing all these crazy stuff, and we released a limited edition, a limited version of these casks at 14 years old. First fill bourbon using this roasted malt. If anyone's tried it, holy shit, that's a good whiskey. Definitely, if you ever see it in random whiskey bars, buy a dram. It's really worth enjoying. But we get into old whiskey now. We get into those crazy Balvenie notes, old rich notes. And I wish I'd been reading the chat to steal some of like your tasting notes on this one, because it was going pretty crazy there for a second. But like baking spice, like it really reminds it. It's quite a strange note. I think that it's more of like what I would class as sherry notes. I'm getting those kind of Christmas cake notes. Yeah, beautiful spices, but very delicate. Brown sugary, oh me. But good whiskey is for drinking, isn't it, sir? Slash. So each one of these whiskies as well was bottled as a single cask bottling. Now, touching on why I'm gutted about this, and I don't have any bottles of this, only 600 bottles of this was ever taken to America. That's why I did not get any. And again, it's big. You know, I drink so much of the 12 and 14, and I love them for being just like my fun any time of day drinking whiskeys. But once you get over that threshold of like 21 years old, although 21 touches on it, age with Balvenie just starts getting serious. And I love how heavy the mouthfeel is on this whiskey, how rich, robust it is. And my counterpart, Gemma, who's our global ambassador, quite often talks about a marmalade note in the whiskey. And I often get like a very sweet kind of candied orange note from 12 Doublewoods, but that's usually as far as it goes. But when she talks about this whiskey, she talks about marmalade. And through growing up, my mother made marmalade for the charity she worked for to make funds for them. And I think that citrus note in the mouth and that heavier, thickness of the whiskey is, marmalade's a great description of it. I love after a drink as well, when you go back to nosing this whiskey, does anyone find that there is it's a little bit blossomy? Or kind of like a little bit more floral. Don't know if that's anything that comes up. I'm rattling through the comments.
So Neil, something that came up on this one actually a couple times is I think there's a big expectation on the color to be much more significant, darker, especially with the age, with the story behind the dark barley, and it's probably the lightest of the group. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so that's a little bit. So honestly, color is one of these wonderful things that is such a hard thing in the whiskey industry to talk about, I think, because a lot of standard bottles use a color caramel, E150C or something. And so that kind of like gives you consistency. A lot of people doubt like where that, you know, how much coloring people add to it. But this is what whiskey looks like after 26 years in 100% ex-bourbon casks. And these were first fill as well. So really big, aggressive first fill casks. American oak just doesn't give you that color. It's only European oak styles that are going to give you that bigger color. And yeah, it's honestly, that's why I took it out of my colored glass, because I wanted to look at this color just to familiarize myself with it. But I would say on what I've got on the 19 wise, they're very similar, if not a little, mine's a little bit darker, but yeah, it's honestly, it's one of the wonders of whiskey that when you're doing single cask bottlings, you've got nothing to hide behind. You've got nothing to give you more color. You know, the usage of marrying different casks together, although we can get like, although people talk about, say, something's a sherry cask or something's just an ex-bourbon cask, the whiskey maker, if he's got a load of off sherry casks that don't taste like sherry casks, they taste like bourbon casks, they're sure as hell going to go in that blend. So that's also something that can raise up color in other whiskeys. But yeah, nothing to hide behind. Balvenie 30s and 40s are a marriage of casks. In fact, what should be released this year, but what's coming out next year, the new Balvenie Rare and Prestige range, starting from 25, 30, 40, and 50, will all be a marriage of vatting of casks. So something David Stewart is exceptionally famous for is, well, actually, no, that's completely wrong. He's not exceptionally famous. He's not really known for this. But what he said to the family on making our whiskey when it was Glenfiddich, Balvenie, even Grants or blended or monkey shoulder or blended malt, was when you're marrying casks together, instead of just emptying them and throwing them into a big steel vat, mixing it and putting it to bottle, the right way, the correct way, the best way of doing that process is actually to fill marrying tons, 1,600 litre capacity vessels. And at the distillery, they empty casks into these, and then different casks that fill up the 1,600 litres of capacity basically let the casks combine their flavor together. Now, ex-bourbon casks are very stable, but sherry casks have got a lot more play on them. And that time in those big oak casks, allowing oxygen just to kind of soften basically the edges of all those miscellaneous casks. So yeah, when it's a single cask, so some you might see bottlings of this that are a bit darker. And to be quite honest with you, now that you mentioned it, I hadn't thought much about the color, but I seem to remember this being a darker whiskey as well. Hey. I wish I drank more of this before I started telling all these stories about this whiskey, because I don't want to put it away. It's so good. Damn it, me talking too much. Right. However, we should move on to the last one. And this is something that I don't drink very much of, because one, I don't see very much of it. And secondly, every time I drink it, and it's not a rare whiskey, but it surprises me, and it surprises me how much I enjoy it. Now, my whiskey journey starts when I open a hotel. I'm a bar manager in a new hotel, and we've got 500 whiskeys in a room that I have to start talking about to customers whenever they want to. As 21, I've got a good cocktail background. I've managed a bar in Aberdeen city centre before. I was 21. I didn't know jack about single malt. You know, it's a scary thing that older men drank. So having this room really gets me into whiskey. And probably about 10 months in, I drink my first Port Ellen. Before then, peat was, I could not do a peated whiskey. I had a Port Ellen, and then I went on a 6-month peat bender. And I drank so much Lagavulin that still I can remember like it oozing out my pores after a hard weekend. Horrible amounts of heavy peated whiskey drinking. And nowadays, I'm a bit soft. I don't like to taste the peated whiskey when I wake up in the morning so much anymore. So I limit myself. But whenever I get this one and I sit down and drink it, I think it's just a real whiskey lover's whiskey. And one thing about whiskey drinkers and whiskey fans like we all are is we don't, we've got our favorites that we kind of have always, but we like to try different things. And this is such a, for me, such a strange kind of whiskey because all the peat that we know about and we think about traditionally is West Coast peat, Isla peat. Peat is all over the world. It's essentially natural matter that has just broken down. It's in a bog, someone cuts it out, dries it, it's really good fuel. It gives off smoke. West Coast peat has a high amount of iodine in it. The natural matter that's built up that peat has come from the sea, essentially. It's on an island. But if you cut peat from Speyside, you get a whole different kind of dirt. That peat from Speyside is going to be made up of a lot more heather. And if you break up Speyside peat, you can see basically heather that hasn't broken down yet. So when burned, this will impart a different flavor onto the liquid. So it comes back to my pal, Ian Miller, Distillery legend. And I think this really epitomizes him getting bored because he comes back from holiday on the West Coast and he says to David Stewart, and let's be honest, he has to get this past the family. He goes, why the hell aren't we doing peated whiskey in Balvenie? And why aren't we doing peated whiskey in Speyside? Why did it bloody well stop? And if you look back traditionally, in the downtime in whiskey distilleries, when there was not enough water to basically produce a whiskey to power the plant, the distillery staff, if they weren't on holiday, would have to go up to the bogs to cut peats. And peats are basically blocks of peat. And it'd be really dirty, heavy work because you're cutting blocks of earth and carrying them down to the distillery. And it would be common practice because that would be the only source of fuel in the area. Sorry. Coal wasn't a thing. So peat was used everywhere. And I kind of, for me personally, peat, I have fond memories. My mother's a physiotherapist and she gets all manner of gifts. One of her customers gave her peat, two Christmases, a load of peat for the fire at home. And it's never been hotter, the house. The way that peat burned that winter, oh my God, it was so hot that it was just crazy. So I always remember peats from that. But using it in Balvenie, something that really hadn't been seen in Speyside for a really long time. I think probably the most famous bottlings is like Wartime Macallan, which goes for crazy money. If you can ever get an opportunity to drink Wartime Macallan peated, invest the money in your palate. You deserve it. But it's really interesting because when we started trialing it, the first trial was in 2001, and the guys weren't sure how it was going to look. But every week since that, apart from this year, sadly, we've ran 1 week of peated malt through our distillery. Hence the reason for the name of this bottle, the Balvenie Week of Peat. And in the early days, and people that are familiar with Balvenie will probably ask the question, what's the difference between this and the other one that came out beforehand? So once the liquid came to age, basically we were like, holy shit, it's good, we should sell that. And I think as marketeers, we got a little bit excited about what we were doing and we bottled a 14-year-old vintage. The only problem with that vintage and what we were selling everywhere in the world apart from travel retail, it was only aged in ex-bourbon casks. and the bottlings were only liquid from ex-bourbon casks. That dialed in with the fact that every year, for the first 3 or 4 years, there was different peating levels to the barley because they were wanting to play around. They wanted to try what this liquid might look to be. So with having, a vintage, it limits you to what you can use, but also not, and stating which cask it is, it limits you to how you get that consistency. If you can put a little bit of sherried liquid in there, that can really temper peat notes. So something that blenders will quite often do if like their blend is too peated, they will basically try and find some sherried peated liquid to temper the kind of effects of like a higher peating. So it's pretty raw. So with this one, with 14 years, we move away from the vintage. We didn't even sell vintage whiskey anyway at Balvenie, so what was the point? Brought it back to the age statement, and we get this, and I get to tell that story of Ian Miller having some fun with his whiskey. So I like my food. Moving to America was pretty damn good because there's barbecue everywhere. And like not shit like British Scottish barbecue that's basically like rubbish stuff. It's the stuff I've seen on television, like really good barbecue. And really for this, it just epitomizes what I like about basically all of that meat and barbecue goodness that I've enjoyed all over this country. And you still straight away have that sweetness. Does LA have barbecue? Serious? No, it's some vegan shit barbecue. It's crap, honestly. It's awful. Now there is a couple of places downtown, but I know when I'm eating it, it's not legit. I need to be anywhere not in California to get good barbecue. I'm sure some pit boss somewhere in California would argue that fact, but I'm with you guys just now. So yeah, California, it's good for sushi and vegan stuff. Come on. But yeah, it just reminds me of like a sweet barbecue sauce, that light of smoke. And one thing that's different with the peat smoke from Speyside to Isla, and something that like to be fair, I eat a lot of vegetarian stuff, but I don't eat sushi, so sorry guys. There's a floral note. Does anyone on the smoke get a more vibrant floral note? And this could really be my brain tricking me often, is that before like we released these peated ones, if we think back to the limited edition range, the first one in the limited edition range of Balvenie was a 17 Isla cask. 17-year-old Balvenie finished in an Isla cask. The last one of those whiskies was the Balvenie 17-year-old peated cask. And I think it's probably one of the most interesting whiskies in the world because, well, sorry, maybe not in the world, but in our range, that instead of finishing in someone else's cask for a different flavor, we used Balvenie casks that had peated Balvenie liquid in them. So when we finished the liquid, we got a very different peat note to the whiskey. And when you nose that whiskey, it's exceptionally floral. You don't get a lot of the peat smoke, and really you have to look for it. But on here, I get that floral notes that I remember from that whiskey. And it could be my brain playing tricks on me. Yum, isn't that good? I probably should have drank all of my 19-year-old Edge of Burnt Ahead Wood before now, because it might be hard to taste it after that, but I love this. Yeah, this has been a really good night for me, guys. For me, thank you very much for inviting me. Look, we've got that sweetness. Something that, and I think one kind of thing I love, like as a tip to describe to like beginner whiskey drinkers when I'm doing like the whole in-house tasting, is Balvenie is really easy to remember. Something that David Stewart has nurtured is our house style. we always have that sweetness and we always have that vanilla. A lot of people probably think that that vanilla 100% comes from the American oak that we use. But if you're to do a chemical analysis of our spirit off the still, it has vanillin compound in it. So, of course, American oak is going to raise that. But honey and vanilla is like the easiest way to make yourself look like a whiskey expert. Because all you have to do is buy a bottle of Balvenie, open it in front of your friends that don't know whiskey and go, honey and vanilla. And no shitting you, if you look on every single one of David Stewart's nosing and tasting notes on our website, you are going to see honey and vanilla everywhere. So much so that our WhatsApp group is like called Honey and Vanilla and Delicate Fruits, because that is like the words David uses to describe his whiskey. But I think it's fair, it works. But then we get that smoke. And also what's nice is, because it's bigger ABV, because it's on chill filtered, it just keeps on giving and giving this whiskey. And yeah, it's a good one. I was really scared that when I looked at the lineup and we had the two absolute ballers of the 19 and the 26, I was like, how can I finish on the 14? It's like, oh, will it be let down? But no, I'm happy. I'm very happy with the structure of how that's gone. So superb. The ABV on this is 48.3.
It would have been really tough to go from this to the 19 or the 26. I think it would have been.
Yeah, it would have killed them.
Yeah. So definitely appreciate that order that you put us through.
Superb.
So one of the questions we got earlier, and I'm sure there'll be additional questions if you guys want to start adding them to the chat, was, with Sir David moving into the end of his career and Kelsey coming in, I'd be curious to know if there's been either discussion or understanding around, is it going to be an evolution of the brand or a wholesale transformation? Is the ton line going to continue? Where do we see, Balvenie going for the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Hopefully still letting me drink their whiskey and talk to you guys. So obviously, like, that question comes up. David's getting old, and when does he, for me, I don't know why he hasn't retired yet, but he loves just working away. So really the progression actually doesn't start with Kelsey. And when we discuss the whole structure of what I said about craftsmen, apprentice craftsmen and master craftsman stages, we have someone pretty badass, kind of probably wanting to have his name on Balvenie as well for a while, which is Brian Kinsman. And Brian Kinsman is a first-class chemist that started working under David, similar route to what Kelsey had, but he was really David's first apprentice. And now Brian Kinsman looks after everything that we make. He takes an interest in Sailor Jerry rum, and how that's made. He's one of 3 people in the world that know the recipe for Drambuie. So it's probably only fair that it's Brian's turn, but with everything that we do with the Balvenie, we try and champion our apprentices as much as possible. It just so happens that an apprentice malt master in particular is a lot more talked about thing than someone working in the floor maltings, essentially. Let's be honest, a lot of those guys in the distillery are nowhere near as well educated as Kelsey, so the level that she can hold herself is a different level, but it's probably Brian's turn for a while. And there's a lot of liquid sitting in those warehouses. That there's skunk works rooms in the warehouses. Who knows where things are going to go over the next few years? But something that we've always been really lucky with is having these people, these stories. At the Balvenie Distillery, none of us take ourselves very seriously, but the whiskey's pretty serious. And we kind of hit a beautiful turning point, and I'm so fortunate to be part of the distillery at this time, that we're seeing this turning point where the people that worked before health and safety took over, when there was stealing of whiskey, when there was like people drunk everywhere, getting up to mischief. These people are all really either leaving the industry, dying, they're getting old, you know, and we're taking this opportunity, while some of them are still around, to like showcase some of these amazing stories and some of these liquids. So for the future, basically the progression of our handcrafted story, which used to look quite cool and unique, now looks the same as every whiskey in the world. We celebrate and champion these people, and who knows where that goes, and where that liquid moves on to. If anyone like does a bit of Googling, you can see the new travel retail releases. It's supposed to be a secret, but they launched it, then this happened. So there's 3 more stories, bottlings going for there. And every one of these bottlings, we give a big story about these people and the history involved in the distillery. So yeah, it's cool. If you want a barrel pick, I'm afraid to say it starts at £2 million per bottle with Balvenie. Family don't want to sell them. Sorry, I'm jumping in on that, on some.
We'll do a GoFundMe or a Kickstart or something for it, I guess.
Yeah, the one a year that we fly billionaires in for is, yeah, it's hard. And yeah, shit. And you've got 25% if you take it to America on top of that. We're not taking the 25 on 2 mil, you know, come on.
Right.
Gee.
Yeah, I mean, come on, that would just be unreasonable to ask.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think the ambassador program for Balvenie is pretty interesting. The work you guys have to go through and what you're asked of to represent the brand. Can you take us through a little bit of that program? I believe you guys go over to the distillery and take on roles and through a few days get to see the whole process really hands-on.
Yeah, so it's quite bad because I'm part of the William Grant & Sons and Ambassador team to say this, but when you look at the collective group of who we have, not just on Balvenie, but in our other brands, there's some pretty cool cats in there and pretty knowledgeable individuals. And the preparation, and I'm fortunate because I'm from the northeast of Scotland. My family's still in Aberdeen, so I've spent a lot of time up at the distillery. But even before really anyone gets out in the ground, they're working parts of the distillery with the staff. And it's quite funny, like Naomi, my East Coast counterpart, the time that everyone has up there is different, and the stories she tells. Now we're in a new time with a new global brand ambassador, Gemma Patterson. She does it slightly differently. Sam Simmons, the old guy who now works for Atom Brands making boutique whiskey, he was just like, here's a rough schedule, just go and speak to people. Because like on my first day, he did not know what I was saying to the distillery maker, the guys in the distillery, that the mother tongue in the northeast of Scotland is what we call Doric. And as an Aberdeen boy, as a city boy, I wouldn't have known very much about it. But when I moved out to the country and started farming, I had to learn basically a whole new language, or I didn't know what was going on. So I could speak in Doric, and I'm chatting away to the boys in Doric, and Sam goes to me, holy shit, you'll do all right up here. Just go and work out what you need to do. So everyone's different, but yeah, everyone gets as much time as they need at the distillery to do every different part of the process. But I think for me, one of the opportunities that I was given was I was asked to do the GCD, which is a general certificate in distillation. And going through that training changes your view on everything. So yeah, we get a lot of time at the distillery. And also if I've got a holiday, it's so much better to stay 5 days up at the distillery at the end of the trip, so I can get 3 weeks back home in Scotland than a 2-week holiday. So I spend a lot of time up there. So yeah.
That's really cool. I'm curious, and I think some of the others as well. How has COVID affected the distillery? Are they do they have to shut down production at all? Are they continuing? Are they using it as a time to look at some of their experimental casks?
Yeah. So with the start of this, basically what happened was everyone that might have had some issues that are potential problems that COVID could basically crush them. So anyone that had asthma or any other underlying problems all got taken off the site and furloughed. The difference is the UK furlough scheme meant they're not really losing out on any money. It's not just the benefit cover that you get here, it's actual cash. So it's not a bad thing, and the government subsidized 80% of that. So everyone that was of a risk got taken out. That was all right. There's plenty of production people. There was areas that didn't need to work, like obviously the tour guides and stuff, so they got pulled as well. But production managed to continue. Not it wasn't running at such a high percentage. Also, there was a week of peat supposed to be booked in for that week, but they checked the stock model, and we've got so much peated liquid. They're like, we don't need to go through all that process. And now people are just getting back to work. So visitor center guys are back, and people that might have had some problems, they're now back. So it's basically running at full flow. The problem really for us comes when you look at bottling lines and things like that. So, and especially when you've got the old bottling line at Dufftown, which is very different to a modern one. It's a little bit more hands-on. So some of that's been a bit slow in our visitor process, but things are getting back to normal.
That's certainly good to hear, and glad to hear that, you know, none of their livelihoods were too greatly affected. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least get Cullen's question in here about the triple cask range going away, being replaced by the new 3 stories. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so triple cask was like a funny one because, again, when you talk about Balvenie, we don't talk about triple casks or things like that. You know, it never fitted in anywhere. And me living in Singapore, I did so much work on this because it's such a big travel retail market. And it was basically because triple cask didn't make sense. That we want you guys to kind of understand our whiskey or what we're bottling. So when you pick up different bottles, you can be like, oh yeah, that's where that Balvenie's gone. And triple cask wasn't kind of really there, I didn't think. And the brand didn't think. But it gave us the opportunity to put in more stories ranges to travel retail, something totally different. And yeah, there's some cool bottlings coming out with that. The Balvenie Rose, which is in there, is going to be interesting. That's red wine casks that's using. There's a peated 17. And there's one other.
Classic is the
it's a classic. The classic, the original classic. So the story of where the double wood comes from is David Stewart produced the first ever finished whiskey or double maturation whiskey in 1983 with the Balvenie Classic. So it's really reliving that story and letting us try what that liquid would have tasted back in the day. So they're the 3, but then there's going to be more. There's stories like like just think of like the most perfect place for hijinks and carry-ons. Whiskey distillery in the 60s and 70s, and men. I feel like
you're on the brink of telling us. I feel like you're on the brink of telling us a secret about a story that's coming out, and you just want to say it so badly.
Honestly, no, I'm good. I've done all my emergency PR training. I'm safe. You know, I don't let shit slip at all unless I've had about 10 beers and 3/4 of a bottle of whiskey.
Keep drinking, then. We'll keep it going. One final question that I have, beyond finding out if you're a Dandies fan or not, but what is one of everybody? I think you ambassadors have seen such incredible things and have great stories from the distillery. What's a really memorable story about the brand, about the distillery, about your experience that you can bring to the club?
Honestly, don't know. One good day. Honestly, I was so privileged on the whiskey bar that I ran when I started kind of in this at 21. I got some like absurd tastings with loads and loads of distilleries around Scotland. But like some of the, as a whiskey lover, then you work for a whiskey company, then you start to see shit. And then your eyes, even years later, you're like, holy shit. And I think the finest one was I had an internal group from Singapore over to the distillery that we'd gone over early, so I could educate these managers in high-level whiskey shit from other companies. And we went around Scotland and did that before their distributors came. And on the last day, we were having lunch in the cafe at Glenfiddich before they went up to Glenlivet to obviously learn about one of our competitors. David Stewart and Kelsey walk in. So they obviously get excited. Half of the cafe gets excited, but the first person David sees is me, and he's like, oh, Neil. So he comes over, and I'm fortunate that as the only Scotsman that was in Asia, I was David's babysitter when he was over in Asia. As a token Scotsman, I was in Seoul, I was in China, and I'm all in Singapore several times, and I was his babysitter. So I've done weeks with David at this point, and honestly, me and David are pals. If you get us together and we're talking like Scottish football, it's really a bit random. And he goes to me, he goes, oh, Neil, oh, what are you doing? And hi guys, how are you doing? Oh, nice to see you. He goes, oh, what are you doing? And I turned around and I said, David, what are you doing this afternoon? He goes, oh, Neil, yeah, we just drove up from Glasgow. We've got 400 casks to sample. We've got 400 casks. They're going into the single barrel 15. And I looked at my guys. The initial word that comes to my mind is very French sounding, and it starts with an F. And I was like, I'm not doing Glenlivet for the 9th or 10th time. Fuck it. I was like, right, guys, come on, chop. Finish your lunch. You need to go up to Glenlivet now. And I was like, David, I'll be 20 minutes. I'll be back down. I'll be with you. And he's like, what, do you not have to take the guests? I was like, they've got a driver. All I need to do is swipe my credit card. I've done Glenlivet many times. I could probably recycle like their whole tour. I'm coming with you. So Glenlivet to Dufftown is 11 miles. I got back there. I got back and forth faster than I've ever done. I got into the visitor center, paid for the 11 guests that were following behind me in a bus, and I had to wait a couple of minutes before they even got there. I'm like, right, guys, here's your receipt. Go and enjoy Glenlivet. I'll see you in a few hours. And that day of exploring those casks with David Stewart and Kelsey, I tapped out at about 140, I think, because the guys were coming back and I had to be back for them. But I also physically couldn't do it anymore because when you have guests in Scotland, it's quite yee-haw. And as soon as you go into the Highlands and you're in Balvenie houses with lots of whiskey, people get sociable. You drink a lot of whiskey. So we'd had a night the night before. And what was funny was the head warehouseman walks out of his truck. He's got a power drill and a little silicone straw. And we just go power drill, straw. A little, and David, I, and Kelsey have got glasses like this, and we just go. And first thing they do is look at the color. The single barrel 15 is sherry cask, so color does matter for that, but you see a lot of difference in the play on color on that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, it'll be nose, and if it passes nose and they maybe really want to drink it, they'll drink it. But they're not going to drink it unless it's super, super good. That's all they do is nose. But I'm there. The first 75 casks are not right. They're rubbish. They're not rubbish. The liquid is just not what we'd expect. It looks more like a 14-year-old Caribbean cask. Now, so it's interesting. And then we went on. This point, my hangover is not getting any better. Oh my gosh, and the head is, but we're still nosing. And then he goes, Neil, you decide. So I'm getting to like decide some with him, and I'm like, yeah, David, I like that one. That's cool. So he's like, yeah, pass that one. So like some of the casts got past my high level nose on that. It was probably a really bad year for quality for them if they was letting me do it. But that's probably one of my favorites. And like doing a tasting of single barrel, that's the one that, you know, makes that whiskey alive for me. So
I feel like that's a story you'll tell your grandchildren for sure, because that's quite an incredible experience. We all may be 4 to 6 ounces into the night, but we do remember that early on you said about 4 words into a sentence that you had a story for later. Do you remember what that was?
I think it was probably covered. Can anyone tell me what it was? what were we talking? Honestly,
I believe the subject was whiskey.
Oh God, thank you for the tip. No, it was covered. Everything I was holding back talking about other people later on. Oh, there's plenty of stories. Gosh. By the way, no, I don't really speak multiple languages. I would like to think after a lot of whiskey or wine or beer anywhere in the world, I'm a bit of a social comedian. So chameleon. So I lived in Austria for 6 months. So my Deutsch is exceptionally Wildschenau Austrian style, and it really comes out of only after a bottle of schnapps. I lived in France for a while. I can order any food in a restaurant, but then that's me screwed on French. And then when I lived in Asia, the locals took the piss so much about tone and everything, I gave up straight away. They were like, Neil, your tone is so wrong. I was like, what? And I would just get battered, whether it was from old ladies at the food court trying to say anything in Singapore, they just bullied me because of my Scottish tongue. So I gave up on Mandarin pretty quickly over there. And of course, man, I'm a dandy Don. I'm not one of these like sellouts that sport Rangers or Celtic. I'm a sheep-shagging bastard till I die. Come on, the Dons. So anyone that really has no idea what the hell we're talking about there, Aberdeen, it's up north.
Oh, yeah.
People in the country like sheep. That's also partly the reason why we have a lot of black-faced sheep in Scotland, because we can find them in the snow and the hills and they can't get away from us, you know. These normal white ones, no use for us in the middle of winter, you know. Perfect. So there you go. So if anyone ever goes to an Aberdeen match at Pittodrie, when you see inflatable sheep getting hit around, that's why essentially we're Aberdeen.
We're on the wrong part of the globe after that discussion.
Yeah. Probably one of the finest kind of jokes I'd ever had is from a Glaswegian a Malaysian guy that lived in Glasgow. And when we were doing a Porsche event, he was one of the pro drivers. He goes, Aberdeen fan, eh? You must have your Velcro gloves. And I had never, I know all the stories about how to stop a sheep with Wellington boots. You put them on the front, they can't run away. But I'd never heard that Velcro glove thing. When I put that on the group chat back home, God, it was like, these things are amazing. Easy to get hold of them. Yes, I hate Stevie G. I didn't like him at Liverpool anyway. Do I enjoy bourbons?
Whoa. No dogging on the Reds, man. Come on.
Don't get me started. That's a whole side conversation.
Yeah, you've got to love Andy Robertson now. So.
I wouldn't trust him in my house, so, you know. Like, horrible. People from Liverpool and Glasgow, gosh, the most dangerous, rough individuals I know. And man, Melissa, get out of here. Sport a real team like Tottenham Hotspur. Come on. Do I like any bourbons? Yes. However, I'm on a massive journey with American whiskey at the moment. I got spoiled in my early days with having Blanton's and Pappy Van Winkle in the whiskey room when I was like 21. And honestly, I'd never really worked anywhere that sold a lot of bourbons, essentially. Like, yeah, I had Elijah Craig on the back bar. I had some, like, gosh, what do we have? We had Well, we had Maker's Mark in the Well. But I have not experienced as much as what I see here. but what I really, really like, and I think it's now I'm reading more and more into it. I'm a bit like embarrassed to say it, but like the Blanton's single barrel stuff that used to be bottled for La Maison de whiskey. Oh, me, lovely. Some of those great,
What?
great whiskeys, but I'm owed that part of the world an education trip. It was supposed to happen this year, and yeah, not yet, but I'm reading into it, so it's going to happen. So it'll be fun. Right.
Well, I tell you what, Neil, I had to go run it down, but next time you come to Texas to do the ton tasting with us, I've got you.
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah, never gonna say no to a Blanton's. Favorite food you've had in your travels? Oh, my favorite, I think, is Malaysian food. Um, what is interesting about Malaysian food, as far as it is so far away from Scottish homely food, Malaysian food is like the most feel-good, happy food in the entire world. That it's not in any way good for you, but whenever I was in like up in Malaysia, especially in trips to Kuala Lumpur, oh my word, ate a lot of Malaysian food, rendang. Like I would eat rendang for breakfast sometimes, and like before moving to Asia, the thought of a curry for breakfast was insane. But if I could sneak in like just before I jumped on the flight, a quick rendang, oh gosh, and their pickle in Malaysia, their akar, which I think also has some Indian kind of historical roots. I could just eat it all day. But I always loved Thailand and Vietnam. But Vietnam was cool because you got a sandwich, and it was the only place in Asia that wasn't all rice and noodles. And their appreciation of a sandwich, in Southeast Asia, their appreciation of a sandwich, I was like, yeah. So as you can see, I always ate well.
Strong bond me. So I think that we've got everybody interested in doing a follow-up, and there's been some discussion around 6 different tons. So we'll definitely be meeting again in the near future.
Who cares about the travel ban? I'll like drive over to Texas if we're doing all the tons on a session. That would be a really, really baller session. That's not one I've done, and it's like a massively interesting talking point because everyone's got their own opinions on each batch, and I've got my own, and they're completely opposite to what the majority of people think about them. So
be careful, because this group will hold you accountable to that statement. It's being recorded, so we'll see you soon.
Hey, I'll drive. It's easy. It's not a problem. Get me out of this place.
Yeah, we'll get you away from the fire tornadoes. Thank you so much for the time, Neil. This has been incredible. Thank you all for the great content, great questions. We are really only powered by you guys. So the more that you engage, the more you get interested in this type of stuff, the more we'll be able to do it. So thanks everyone for getting on the call today. I have 3 requests. Be loud, wear green, go Stars.